October 27, 1962. Inside a radar station in Alaska, an operator's face goes pale. A blip on his screen shows an American U-2 spy plane, but it's heading in the wrong direction. Not over international waters, not over Cuba. It's drifting into Soviet airspace. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, with nuclear-armed missiles already positioned and both superpowers on the edge of annihilation, this wasn't just a navigational error. This was the kind of mistake that could end the world. And within minutes, U.S. commanders would face an unthinkable decision: shoot down their own pilot before he triggers a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just tense, it was a 13-day countdown to potential Armageddon. Soviet nuclear missiles sat in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. American warships blockaded the island. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev knew that one miscalculation, one misread signal, could spiral into full-scale nuclear exchange. In this environment, every military movement was scrutinized. Every flight path mattered. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was America's eye in the sky. Flying at 70,000 feet, above the reach of most Soviet fighters, these planes photographed missile sites, military installations, and troop movements. They were essential to U.S. intelligence, but they were also provocative. Just 18 months earlier, Francis Gary Powers had been shot down over Soviet territory in a U-2, igniting an international incident and destroying a peace summit. Now, during the most dangerous standoff in human history, another U-2 was about to violate Soviet airspace. Not by choice, by accident. Captain Charles Maltby wasn't a reckless pilot. He was a decorated Air Force officer, methodical and experienced. On the night of October 26th, he was assigned what seemed a routine mission: fly a U-2 from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska up toward the North Pole to collect air samples. The U.S. was monitoring Soviet nuclear tests, and high-altitude atmospheric sampling was critical intelligence work. Boring, technical, safe. But there was nothing routine about flying a U-2. The cockpit was cramped. The pressure suit was suffocating. Pilots breathed pure oxygen for hours before takeoff to avoid decompression sickness. Once airborne, they were alone, 70,000 feet above the Earth in near total darkness, navigating by the stars. And on this particular night, the stars would betray him. Maltby took off just after midnight. His flight plan was straightforward: head north, collect samples, return to base. But something was wrong from the start. A massive solar storm was sweeping across the northern hemisphere, flooding the atmosphere with radiation and scrambling radio communications. His navigation equipment, which relied on celestial positioning, began to malfunction. The magnetic interference threw off his readings. The aurora borealis danced across the sky, beautiful and disorienting. He thought he was heading south, back toward Alaska. He wasn't. He was drifting west.
Toward Siberia. By the time Maltby realized something was off, he had crossed into Soviet airspace. Not by a few miles. Deep into the Chukotka Peninsula, over 600 miles inside enemy territory, and he had no idea how to get out. Back at Eielson, radar operators watched in horror as Maltby's blip moved farther and farther into Soviet airspace. They tried to radio him. Nothing. The solar storm had killed communication. They tried emergency frequencies, silence. Then the calculations hit. If the Soviets detected him, and they almost certainly had, they would interpret this as an act of war. Not a lost weather plane, not a civilian aircraft, a U.S. military reconnaissance aircraft violating Soviet airspace during the Cuban Missile Crisis. To Soviet commanders, this could only mean one thing. The Americans were conducting pre-strike reconnaissance. A nuclear first strike could be minutes away. In Washington, the Pentagon scrambled. Fighter jets launched from Alaska. F-102 Delta Daggers, armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles. Their orders were deliberately vague, but the implication was terrifying. If Soviet fighters shot down Maltsby, the U.S. would retaliate. If Maltsby's intrusion triggered a Soviet response, the crisis could explode into full war. Some officials even discussed whether American fighters should shoot down Maltsby themselves, force him down before the Soviets mistook his presence for an attack. It was the worst possible timing. Just hours earlier, another U-2 had been shot down over Cuba, killing Major Rudolph Anderson. Tensions were at a breaking point. Now a second American spy plane was wandering over Soviet soil, and no one knew if Maltsby was still alive or if Soviet missiles were already in the air. On the Soviet side, chaos mirrored chaos. Radar stations across the Far East detected the intruder. Fighters scrambled from airfields in Chukotka. MiG interceptors climbed toward the target, trying to reach the altitude where the U-2 flew. Anti-aircraft batteries went on alert. Soviet commanders radioed Moscow. What were the Americans doing? Was this a reconnaissance flight for an imminent nuclear strike? Was this the war everyone feared? Declassified Soviet documents later revealed just how close things came. The local air defense commanders had authority to engage. If those MiGs had reached Maltsby, if they'd gotten a clear shot, they would have fired. And if they had, the U.S. would have known within minutes that an American pilot had been shot down over Soviet territory during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy's military advisors were already pushing for strikes on Cuba. Another shootdown might have been the final straw. But the MiGs couldn't reach him. At 70,000 feet, Maltsby was just beyond their ceiling. They climbed, strained, fell back. The Soviet fighters circled below, waiting for him to descend into kill range. Maltsby, meanwhile, had figured out he was in serious trouble. The stars didn't match his charts. He couldn't raise anyone on the radio. And his fuel gauge was dropping fast. The U-2 had no weapons, no defenses, and limited fuel reserves. If he didn't find Alaska soon, he'd run out of gas over Soviet territory. And then he'd be in a glide path straight down into hostile ground, surrounded by Soviet fighters. He made a desperate calculation. He turned southeast, hoping, praying that he was heading toward Alaska and not deeper into Siberia. He was flying blind, using dead reckoning and gut instinct. Finally, faintly, he picked up a radio signal. American voices. Eielson was trying to guide him home, but communication was broken and intermittent. He couldn't confirm his position. Ground controllers vectored him as best they could, but they were guessing too. Then the F-102s arrived, unarmed. Well, armed, but not supposed to engage. They formed up around him, creating a protective corridor.
If Soviet fighters followed Maltsby across the border, the F-102s would intercept. The risk of escalation was enormous. Those American fighters carried nuclear-tipped missiles. If a dogfight broke out, even a conventional exchange could spiral. Maltsby's fuel light was flashing red. He was minutes from flameout. The F-102s guided him toward the Alaskan coast, and he began a long, powerless glide. His engine quit. The U-2 became a sailplane, descending silently through the Arctic night. He made it. Barely. Maltsby glided onto a frozen airstrip at Kotzebue, Alaska, touching down with no fuel and no engine. When he climbed out of the cockpit, he was shaking, not just from cold,
but from the realization of what had almost happened. The Pentagon reaction was immediate. Commanders were furious, terrified, and relieved all at once. How had this been allowed to happen? Why was a U-2 flying during the most volatile moment of the crisis? Kennedy himself was reportedly stunned when he learned of the incident. In a meeting with advisors, he remarked grimly that there was always some son of a bitch who didn't get the word. Publicly, the incident was buried. The Soviets didn't publicize it either. Neither side wanted to explain how close they had come. But privately, both governments understood. They had dodged a bullet, a navigational error, a solar storm, and a few minutes of confusion had nearly triggered the nuclear war everyone feared. Maltby was quietly reassigned. No court-martial, no public blame, just a silent acknowledgement that he had survived one of the most dangerous flights in history. The Maltby incident remains one of the least-known flashpoints of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but historians now recognize it as one of the most dangerous. On October 27, 1962, Black Saturday, as it's now called, multiple events nearly pushed the world over the edge. Anderson was shot down over Cuba. Soviet submarines, under depth-charge attack, came close to launching nuclear torpedoes, and Maltby drifted into Soviet airspace. Any one of those incidents could have triggered war. Together, they created a cascade of miscommunication and fear that brought humanity to the brink. What saved us wasn't just luck, it was restraint. Soviet commanders didn't fire when they had the chance. American commanders didn't escalate when provoked. Kennedy and Khrushchev, despite immense pressure, chose caution over retaliation. But the Maltby incident revealed something terrifying, how fragile that restraint was. One lost pilot, one solar storm, and a few minutes of confusion had nearly triggered the nuclear war everyone feared. It's a reminder that history doesn't just turn on grand strategies and political decisions. Sometimes it turns on a single blip on a radar screen, drifting in the wrong direction.